Okay, our next speaker is Luke Dowd. Luke is a researcher in the UCD Department of Agriculture, and he's currently working on a DAFM funded project called Adapt for Resilience, which aims to help us understand how changes in climate may impact on the sustainability of Irish forestry, and to examine pathways which may reduce the negative effects of climate change on Irish forests. But his topic for this evening is carbon dynamics in Irish forests. So over to you, Luke.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicholas. And thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. Just to make sure you can see the screen and everything's working okay at the moment.
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, my name's Luke Dowd. I'm a PhD student in UCD on the ADAPTForRes project, which is looking to increase the resilience of Irish forests given the challenge of climate change. That's actually being conducted across three separate pillars. The first of which is forest genetic options, second is forest management practices, and the third is forest protection measures. So I'm within pillar 2, forest management practices, and specifically I'm really looking at resilience through the lens of carbon. I'm really looking at forestry as a carbon store and how can we protect those carbon stores and increase sequestration given climate change. So that is why I'm here today to speak to you about carbon dynamics. So what I hope to cover today is, I suppose, an introduction to forest carbon and give you a bit of an Irish context. I always find it's important to, I suppose, frame the conversation and to give context what we'll be speaking about. How are forest carbon stores actually measured? I'll go through an example of a Sitka spruce plantation on a gley soil, which will hopefully be quite relevant to a few of you here today. And then I'm also going to touch on a mixed species forest on a peat soil, which is the whole topic of forestry and peatlands is becoming more and more relevant. So we'll touch on that, and then I suppose hopefully tie it all together with the touching on the increasing relevance and why this is becoming more important. So we're going to start fairly simple, excuse me, but carbon sink, you're absorbing more carbon than it releases, and a carbon source, you're releasing more carbon than it absorbs. Next up, we have gross primary productivity. So all I'm trying to get, the only point I'm trying to get across here, if you remember anything, is just the idea of gross and net. In regards to reporting on carbon stores, there's the whole idea of gross and net. So you have your gross primary productivity, which is the total amount that your forest is sequestering. But you also need to take into account the respiration from that system as well. So you have autotrophic and heterotrophic respiration, basically the release of carbon dioxide by the plants, but also by decomposing material as well. So to get to your net figure, your net ecosystem productivity, you need to balance these. You need to take into account fluxes in and out of the system. And your net ecosystem productivity basically tells you if you're acting as a source or a sink. So there's actually 5 forest carbon pools. In regard to international reporting requirements, we actually need to report on these 5 forest carbon pools. So the above ground biomass is the obvious one. It is the stem, it is the timber, it is the branches, the foliage, is everything. Below ground biomass, you have your roots, the major root ball, but you can get down to as small as between 2 to 5 millimeters if you really want to get specific. You have your dead wood, your standing dead trees, your fallen dead trees, and woody debris. You've litter and partially decomposed material on the forest floor. This is seasonal fluctuations and is different if you're in a broadleaf forest compared to a conifer forest. And then you've your soil carbon. I'm just going to give you, I suppose, 3 seconds to think about which you would think to be the major carbon store in Irish forests, because personally I found it fairly interesting when I saw it first. So this is from the National Forest Inventory in 2022. So this is actually a breakdown of the carbon stocks within Irish forests currently. And as you can see, soil carbon is the predominant store here and the major player. This is a little bit skewed maybe because we have a high proportion of peat soils, and peats are particularly high in carbon content. But when we're actually talking about the tree aspect, you're only talking about around 20% when you're looking at the above and below ground. One other small point to note is that litter and deadwood pool is fairly insignificant in Irish forests. That is because they are highly managed, intensively managed, and in maybe a more of a natural forest ecosystem, you would expect to see more in those pools. So actually, how are forest carbon stores actually measured? So the bread and butter is field measurements and inventory, and then you apply an allometric equation. An inventory, just as you would do a timber inventory, it's the same thing. It's just then applying an allometric equation. And I'm going to leave that there because I'm going to expand upon that on my next slide. But some of the other ways in which kind of forest carbon stores are measured are satellite imagery. increasingly now, as satellites, the resolution of which is increasing, it is becoming more and more relevant. It's really applicable in places like the Amazon and the Congo, and it's really good for tracking land use change and deforestation. But again, that is all linked back to, I suppose, field measurements and allometric equations, which need to be done. And then you have carbon models. So carbon models and laser scanning is you're kind of into the realm here now of research and what I'm trying to conduct. So carbon models, you can put in as many inputs as you want. You can have up to 200 different variables and input them all in. It all depends on the model. And then you have laser scanning. So that's that image on the right or left, whichever. So allometric equations require destructive sampling. So you actually have to go down and fell trees. So I'm trying to use this approach of laser scanning so that you can actually scan a tree, and as opposed to actually having to fell the trees, you can actually scan them and try and figure out carbon content and volume that way. So that's currently some of the work that I'm conducting as part of the project. But back to our allometric equation. So as I said, it involves destructive sampling. So you actually need to fell the tree, get it on the ground, and you need to weigh absolutely everything, every branch, every leaf. First and foremost, you need to split the tree up into its different components. You need to split the crown up into 3 separate thirds. You need to split the stem up, and then you need to take subsamples from that, and you need to bring it back to the lab, and you need to dry it for 3 days in an oven. You need to remove all moisture content entirely. You need to get the dry weight biomass before you can actually get to, I suppose, the carbon content part. But you can see here, it's fairly clunky. It's fairly labor intensive. There's actually only one allometric equation to describe the carbon content of a forestry species in Ireland, not for Sitka spruce. It's a fairly good starting point because it is 50% of the forest estate, but there's not really any other allometric equations in Irish conditions. There is some what we call the back of the envelope kind of estimates, but in regard to specifics, there's not a huge amount. So this is actually what an allometric equation is. So basically, when you actually sum all the components together and you get your total dry weight biomass, you just link that then to its diameter. So that's all an allometric equation is. You're linking a difficult to measure variable to an easy to measure variable, such as diameter. And then once you've plotted all your information, which are my blue dots here, you just draw a line through it. That's it. I remember being intimidated by this at the start, but it is not too bad. You're drawing a line of best fit through the information, and then you just have an equation which describes that line. So you can see the equation there. And basically all you're doing is you fill in the DBH, and that is essentially going up to that red line and bringing it across, and it gives you an estimation of dry weight biomass. That is all that an allometric equation really is. It just takes quite a bit of work to get there, I suppose, in the first point. So to actually hopefully tie all of this together and to make it relevant, and hopefully it'll make some sense. So I've been working with Norway spruce and birch. They're the 2 species that I'm working with. As I was talking about, dry weight biomass is the important thing in all of this. So if you have a tree, let's just take the example of a 100-kilo tree fresh weight. So that's equivalent to a 12 to 14 centimeter birch or Norway spruce. You get that on the ground, it's 100 kilos fresh. You need to remove all moisture content from that. So then let's say, just for simplicity's sake in this argument, the moisture content was 50%. The moisture content varies from section to section and overall can change from species to species and tree to tree. But for this example, we're going to say 50% dry weight. So you're down to 50 kilos then after you dry it. You then need to apply your carbon fraction. So your carbon fraction is on your dry weight biomass, and your carbon fraction is 0.5. That is used for international reporting requirements. That is the standard use. There are species-specific carbon fractions. For example, birch is 0.47 and Norway spruce is 0.49, but you can see why the carbon fraction of 0.5 is kind of the standardized one that is used. So ultimately, you have 25 kilos worth of stored carbon in that 100-kilo tree that is fresh weight in the forest. So just to give you an indication. So moving on to Sitka plantation and to go through some of the carbon stores within a Sitka plantation in Irish conditions. So this is the most up-to-date information that we actually have. So this is the allometric equation that we actually have in Irish conditions. This study, what they did is they took a chronosequence, which is basically instead of tracking a forest from when you first planted to 40 years or 45 years when you're felling it, they took intervals. So they measured a forest at 9 years old, they measured a forest at 14, etc. And then they built a relationship over time. And what they found was afforested Sitka spruce stands are actually carbon sinks at 10 years old and possibly earlier. So that possibly earlier is really dependent on productivity. The more productive the stand, quicker it's going to turn into a sink. The maximum NEP, so hopefully you might remember that figure of that idea of net and gross. So the net ecosystem productivity of a Sitka spruce stand maxes out at 9 tons of carbon per hectare per year. Now, this is just before the first thinning. It is before canopy closure. It is when the forest is, the no mortality has occurred. It is when all the available space is essentially being used. But to compare that to, I suppose, European example, the maximum NEP that can be achieved in continental Europe is 6.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So it just goes to show that Sitka here grows incredibly well and is incredibly productive. Now, obviously, it kind of reaches a peak and then it's not sustainable for it to maintain that level of sequestration, and it reduces to around 2 tons of carbon per hectare per year in a more older thin stand, which is kind of approaching more of a clear fell. And that's just because there's higher amounts of decomposition, there's other things at play, and it's not growing as quickly. And this here is the allometric equation that I was trying to talk about. So if you know the diameter and the height of a Sitka tree, you can insert that into this equation and it'll give you your dry weight biomass. And then whatever figure that gives you, you half it, and that is the amount of carbon that is stored within that tree. So just to give you examples. So what I'm going to do now is just take you through, I suppose, a few timestamps. So this stand is 14 years old. So I'm going to go through the 14-year-old one first, of course. So if you're up around your 2,500 stems per hectare, you can see where all the different carbon stores are in relation to the forest. So you can see it's broken down into below ground stems, etc. And you can see the total carbon stores are 36 tons of carbon per hectare. So then when you jump to the 22-year-old stand, you can see that there's a significant jump in carbon stores. So you're going from 36 to 114. And this stand has been thinned, so you're down around the 1,200 stems per hectare. But you can see the stem is the major carbon store within this, as you would expect. And then we're going to jump on to, I suppose, a stand that's nearing that clear fell age. So around 45 years old. So again, I want to emphasize these were stands planted on a glaze soil, and they're all standardized at a yield class 22. So productive, but not jumping out of the ground. This stand had been thinned 5 times. You're down to that 700-800 stems per hectare. And you can see the total carbon stores are 211 tons of carbon per hectare. So within that, of course, the stem is the major component. It's 72% of that. And that equates to 152 tons of carbon per hectare. When you actually convert that into a timber product, it equates to 136 tons of carbon per hectare. So from that initial figure of 211 tons of carbon per hectare, when you're actually converting that into a timber product, you're looking at around 136 tons of carbon per hectare, which is actually being turned into a harvested wood product, which can actually store carbon, hopefully for a long period of time. The rest of it is pretty much returned into the system, the below ground biomass. All the rest of it is left on site in a lot of cases, and it does return into the system. So this is pretty much it here when you track it over time. So you can see between the ages of 9 and 22, that line is fairly steep. You kind of have an exponential growth. The growth of a forest starts off kind of slow. That's why it doesn't turn into a sink until 10 years old. Starts off slow and then it gets exponential and then it kind of plateaus off again. It follows the kind of an S shape. But basically, I would just want to make the point that I suppose carbon sequestration reaches a steady state. I suppose it maxes out at a certain point. And I suppose sequestration through afforestation is finite. It is, I suppose, short term in the grand scheme of things, and it is reversible as well. When you have your maximum carbon stores, it's, I suppose, when the highest risk and the most potential for damage is there. So, no conversation about peatlands, no conversation about carbon and forestry in Ireland is really complete without touching on peatland forestry in particular. So just a quick definition of peatlands, that they're wetland ecosystems. They accumulate organic matter under water saturated soil conditions. An interesting fact that I find anyways about peatlands is peatlands cover 3% of the world's surface, but estimates state that they actually store more carbon than all of the tropical rainforests combined. And tropical rainforests cover just over 7% of the world's surface. So it really speaks to how potent carbon store peatlands are, but also how potent the carbon source they can be as well. This is really relevant to us here in Ireland because 21% of Ireland's land surface is a peat soil. So 2.3 billion tons of CO2 is stored there. Ireland's has a checkered past with peatlands. I suppose for the majority of the last 3 centuries, peatlands areas have been exploited and drained for either agriculture or for afforestation as well. More than 1/3 of Irish forests are actually planted on peat soils. when I say peat soils, I'm using, the definition is any soil with at least a 30 centimeter thick layer of peat. So this is the definition that DAFM is using now in regard to ruling out areas for afforestation, but that is the definition which is used. So 38% of Irish forestry is currently planted on peatlands or peat soils. One of the reasons that we have such a high proportion of forestry planted on peat soils is governmental policy from the 50s to the 80s. So no afforestation was actually to occur if there was agricultural use possible for the land. And just to really, I suppose I'm going to hammer this point home anyways, but drainage and conversion of peatlands results in CO2 emissions via peat decomposition. So just emphasizing that point again, afforested peatlands release CO2. And there's, so to actually quantify this, there's things called emission factors for peat soil. So if you plant forestry on a peat soil, there is an associated emissions factor, which basically takes into account how much emissions there are from the peatland resource. So estimates vary from between 1 to 2.6 tons of carbon per hectare per year to be emitted from this peatland, which is being degraded or drained. And the only thing is, these estimates are very coarse. So you're trying to apply one figure to all peatland areas, all peatland depths, all afforested peatlands, and it's not a very accurate way of doing things because, as you can see, there's huge variations dependent upon the peatland depth, the peatland type, and the species that you plant upon it. So it's a very coarse way of looking at it, and it is an ongoing area of research. But at the moment, the best estimate that we have of an emissions factor from an afforested peatland is 1.68 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So to actually tie this together, this is one of the study sites that I'm working on. It is a peatland site just outside of Edenderry in Offaly. It is a Coillte owned. It's a former Bord na Móna site, so it's a previously harvested basin peat. This site actually has a flux tower, so it is an eddy covariance flux tower installed at it. So one of the students, there's 3 PhD students within this pillar. One is Stephen Byrne in Trinity College. He's looking at the eddy covariance, so he's getting half-hour interval measurements on the fluxes associated with this site. Another PhD student, Blair Roofing in University of Limerick, is teasing apart, I suppose, the soil carbon fluxes, and then I'm looking at the woody biomass side of things. But this site it's actually a second rotation. So it was harvested in 2010. So at the time of sampling, it was around 13 years old. And this is it here. So it hasn't been thinned yet. So actually those solar panels that you're seeing there is the power source for our flux tower. So we're actually getting these measurements. But it's incredibly dense and thick stand, so it hasn't been thinned yet. It's, as I said, it was around 13 years old at the time of this photo anyways. It's predominantly Norway spruce and birch, but there's considerable ingrowth from willow and lodgepole pine as well, and you're up around 5,400 stems per hectare. It's incredibly dense, and there's a huge amount of split stems. It's not a particularly nice stand. But when we actually look at the carbon stores, I suppose the thing that I want to draw your attention to here, and the thing that is most interesting, is the Norway spruce is 43% of the stocking, but it's only 26% of the carbon stores. So this site, you already have to consider that there is considerable emissions from the peatland. And now if you're talking about going in and actually managing this site for commercial rotation, which, as you would expect, you need to remove the birch, which is the majority of the carbon stores. So this will further add to the emissions associated with this site. And to kind of, I suppose, summarize it all down, the total carbon stores for this site are around 32 tons of carbon per hectare per year. Unfortunately, I only have one set of inventory, so I'm only a year and a half in to my PhD. So I'm still learning, and I've only done one set of inventory. So this average growth rate is a very coarse way of looking at it, but I haven't done my second set of inventory to actually figure out the current annual increment. But that average growth rate is 2.45 tons of carbon per hectare per year. We need to take into account our emissions factor of 1.68 tons of carbon per year. And this is even before we consider that idea of ecosystem respiration. So I suppose, is this site acting as a source or a sink? According to the eddy covariance measurements, which we're gathering from it on a half-hour basis, it is acting as a considerable source of emissions, which is fairly damning. To me, when I first found this out, I found it incredibly counterintuitive that you can have a forest area acting as a fairly considerable source of emissions, but that is what the data is telling us. And as I said, this speaks to, I suppose, the management of this stand. If you want to go in and remove the birch and release the Norway spruce, can that Norway spruce get to a productivity to actually offset the emissions. So that is one of the questions that I hope to answer over the course of my studies. What is the best management? I suppose looking at it in a very coarse way of looking at it as a carbon management, and then actually take into account practical considerations as well, because there's no point in saying if you. So that is something that I hope to dig into, I suppose, what is the best management for a site like this, carbon management, and then practical implications as well. So why is forest carbon and all this becoming so relevant? I suppose if you've heard of the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the International Climate Change, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, loads of acronyms, but within a lot of these climate change agreements, there's a category called LULUCF, land use change and forestry. And land use change and forestry is a sector which covers forest land, cropland, grasslands, wetlands, harvested wood products, etc. And basically, Ireland is a total outlier in the rest of Europe in that this sector, LULUCF, is actually acting as a considerable source of emissions. On top of that, forestry has traditionally been acting as a sink, but forestry is now also due to become a source of emissions between 2025 and 2030, probably a lot closer to 2025. And one of the reasons, and this has been known since 2009. So Eugene Hendrick and Kevin Black kind of first noticed this idea of a carbon cliff. So you can see here they didn't expect us to plant anything less than 3,500 hectares of forestry a year, but I suppose that 1,600 that were planted last year is not a very good indictment, and that is why we're heading towards Irish forestry becoming a source of emissions sooner rather than later, and possibly for a while. So Irish forestry is due to become a source of emissions because 38% of our forests are on peat soil, so we need to take into account that emissions factor. The age class structure, forests are nearing clear fell age. A huge amount of forestry was planted in the 1990s, and it's getting to that stage where there is a clear fell. So there is emissions associated with that. And then the one thing that we could have controlled, I suppose, is the lack of planting over the last 20 years. So the target of 8,000 hectares per year of afforestation, which was set by the government to sustain a vibrant industry and also for us to actually reach our climate targets. The last time that was reached was 2007. And as I said, last year, we only planted 1,600 hectares of forestry. So it's not looking overly good, if I'm being totally honest. And I suppose this is not my area of expertise by any make, shape, or form, this whole idea of carbon markets, but regulatory and voluntary. This whole idea of net zero by 2040, 2050. It's something I'm somewhat aware of. I know it's there, but it's not something I know too much about. But my understanding is, I suppose, such that if you sell the carbon credits to your forest, you cannot harvest that forest. And currently, the timber value is far outweighs the carbon value. And whether that might change when we're getting to that 2040, 2050 area, possibly. But as of right now, the timber value, particularly in a Sitka plantation, is far more. Where I can see maybe potential for that down the road is, I suppose, the idea of some of these the new schemes in regards to riparian zones or maybe biodiversity areas where if you could actually, I suppose, maybe that's where there's potential for these carbon markets. But yeah, as I said, that's not my area of expertise. That's the only thing I can really say on it, to be honest. But yeah, I want to thank you again, all for, I suppose, listening first and foremost, and for the opportunity to speak here today. It's one thing to, I suppose, do research but it's another thing entirely to actually be able to talk about it and to present it to somewhat interested parties. So thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them.
Unmute. Thank you very much, Luke. That was extremely informative, and certainly I'd say increased everybody's knowledge of the situation with regard to carbon sequestration and the difference between a sink and a source. I have a few questions. The first couple of questions come from Linny O'Connell. Is it true that it is difficult and expensive to measure soil carbon sequestration? And I'll ask her second question as well. Can farmers with forestry take advantage of carbon credits in Ireland? You possibly won't be able to answer the second one, but you may be able to answer the first one, I think.
So measuring soil carbon stocks is quite complex. Yeah, it involves soil chamber measurements. This is where one of the other PhD students, Blair Roofing in University of Limerick, is looking at the soil carbon aspect side of things, but I know that it's incredibly intensive. The measurements in which she has to gather. She's in the forest regularly, just trying to quantify, I suppose, respiration impacts and emissions associated with it. So in regard to quantifying soil carbon, it is quite difficult to, I suppose, dig into the dynamics. In regard to peatland, quantifying that's complicated as well. So thankfully, I've gotten the job of quantifying the woody biomass. That's, while still pain in the arse, it's not as complicated as the soil.
Okay, it's probably not her area of expertise, so it's maybe an unfair question, but she does ask as well, do you reckon that farmers will be able to take advantage of carbon credits, farmers with forestry, that is, in the future?
As I said, someone described it to me recently as, I suppose, a Wild West. There's not a huge amount of policy in place, so it's an interesting idea. I think, to be honest, it's going to have to develop over time. As I said, at the moment, if you were to sell the carbon credits, you are relinquishing the timber value. So at the moment, the timber value far outweighs the carbon value, and I wouldn't be overly worried about it. It's, as I said, maybe when we're getting to that 2040, 2050 area, when carbon, they're probably assigning a value to carbon, that's where you could see it maybe changing. But as of right now, I'm not aware of any schemes in which that there is any, I suppose, payment for carbon, unless you want to try going to the voluntary markets.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. The next question stroke comment is really a comment, but I read it anyway. It's from Jim Crowley, and he says in 2023, 1,651 hectares of forestry were planted, the lowest since the 1940s. 2,273 in 22 and 2016 and 21. Ireland needs to refocus on planting commercial forests that make sense for private landowners and that provide a valuable timber resource to support home building and a low carbon future that we need. Irish forestry is on its knees. We need to look after the financial return to the landowner and promote the economic benefits of commercial forests. Otherwise, they won't plant. And that's fair enough. And I don't suppose you need to answer that, but you may, if you want to comment on it. I'm going to just ask another question at the same time from Eugene Kelly. Any rough estimate of sequestration in a mixed broadland woodland on non-peat soil? If you take that one first anyway.
Yeah, so I've actually 3 study sites that we're looking at, and we're trying to tease them apart. So one is a commercial plantation, Sitka, which you kind of saw. The other is the peatland site, but I didn't get a chance to cover, I suppose, the third site, which is mixed species, mixed age, broadleaf dominated forest in Laois. So that area, again, looking at the ediocovariance data preliminarily. So we're at the stage where, as I said, we're only kind of a year and a half, 2 years in, so there's still more work to be done. But that site is, so first and foremost, it's not being managed. So this area there's considerable amount of deadwood, there's considerable kind of regeneration. It's just been left to go wild. And that forest, that mixed broadleaf forest, which has been left to its own devices, is actually pretty neutral. It's not acting as a source or a sink. It's kind of pretty middling, which was actually quite interesting. As I said, that's preliminarily. And as I said, that's also without management. So this is where, if you actively manage, you can, I suppose, remove crop trees before they degrade, or before they are blown over, or before disturbance can impact them. And then you can turn that into a harvested wood product and sequester it. And then you can also increase growing space and allow for more trees to actually fill into that void and remove that, I suppose, that decomposition of the deadwood. So as I said, that's the only one that we have, I suppose, in Irish conditions at the moment. But yeah, of the 3 sites that we have, the Sitka conifer plantation is sequestering the most carbon, and it is the largest carbon store.
Okay. And would you like to comment on Jim Crowley's comments about the general state of Irish forestry, which I think we're all in agreement with? Do you have an opinion on that?
I've met Jim before, and I very much agree with him, and I've kind of touched on this topic. It is the idea of Irish forestry becoming a source of emissions is, to me, lunacy. The fact that there was a maybe excuse previously in which we sleepwalk towards it, but at this stage, it's not sleepwalking. We're fully aware, and the Department of Agriculture is fully aware of how bad this issue is. So we need to start planting forestry. And we need to start planting it 10 years ago. So I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know how that then you're into the realm of, but yeah, it's a sad state of affairs in which forestry is acting as a source of emissions within this country.
Okay. And I have one question myself. I'm sure you're aware of the Teagasc carbon measuring tool, which clearly, in my view, shows that commercial forestry is the way forward in terms of carbon sequestration. Would you like to comment on that, or are you aware of it?
I've heard of it, all right, yeah. I suppose it's interesting in regard to, I suppose, management and objectives. So this is where I suppose commercial and carbon sequestration are quite go hand in hand. They go quite well together.
Right.
When you have to try and fulfill multiple objectives within one area, you are, I suppose, reducing the impact. So Anya was saying it, the average forest size in Ireland is just around 8 hectares. When you're trying to get that 8 hectare parcel of land to fulfill carbon sequestration, commercial timber, biodiversity, recreation, water quality, your ability to, I suppose, maximize your objectives is going to be diminished. You're going to be kind of, so there is an element to that, and that's something that I am also hoping to look at in that regard, that multi-objective management. Is there something else that we can do? It's an area that I am quite interested in, that whole idea of, I suppose, maximizing your objectives. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And Eugene wants to know, how old was the Leash woodland?
So that site is quite interesting. It's completely mixed age. It's been a forest site for the last 400 years. It's a gorgeous woodland. It's incredible to actually be able to work on it. But it's a bit part mix of mixed species and mixed ages. We've done some inventory, but we actually trying to establish ages is quite difficult because it's basically as natural of a stand as you're going to get within Irish conditions. So in regard to age, it is mature. So you have large dominant trees, but you also have that understory canopy growing up, which is just very young as well. So it's mature woodland. Unfortunately, I don't have an exact age. It's not managed as a actively managed forest, so there's no planting date. It's been a forest site for the last 400 years, so to quantify that is quite difficult, I'm afraid.
Okay. Thank you. Before I let Luke depart, does anybody else have any more questions? I've run out of questions. Oh, hold on now. I think there's another one coming in. Maybe not. Yes, there is. From Eamon Mansfield. Would the promotion of CCF ameliorate the carbon cliff?
The whole thing with that's something that we want to look at as well. I suppose, what forest management practices can we use to, I suppose, to limit this carbon cliff? It's something that I hope to look into. I'm not sure, but no matter what, we're kind of past the point of no return. Irish forestry is going to be a source. There's no denying it, and the whole nature of forestry is that it's a long term in nature. You can't click your fingers and plant forestry, and also even at that point, it takes time for it to turn into a sink. Maybe a movement to CCF in some areas could increase carbon stores. But in regard to, I suppose, the short term, there's not much we can do. In regard to long term, that's something I hope to look at, and picking into the idea of CCF as an alternative and seeing how that holds up in regard to, I suppose, the Clearfell system. But as I said, unfortunately, I'm only a year and a half in, so maybe at the end of it, I'll have a lot more answers for you all.
Okay. Well, on that note, Luke, thank you very much I consider a really interesting talk, and I hope we'll talk again. So thank you very much. And I'm up to date. I'm up to time now on that part of our webinar. So we're going to move over to the AGM at this stage. So thanks to everybody for their attendance, and thanks for the questions, and thanks to our speakers. Okay. So okay. Our next speaker is Luke Dowd. Luke is a researcher in the UCD Department of Agriculture, and he's currently working on a DAFM funded project called Adapt for Resilience, which aims to help us understand how changes in climate may impact on the sustainability of Irish forestry, and to examine pathways which may reduce the negative effects of climate change on Irish forests. But his topic for this evening is carbon dynamics in Irish forests. So over to you, Luke.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicholas. And thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. Just to make sure you can see the screen and everything's working okay at the moment.
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, my